It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp, and we're so excited to be back for Season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. This week, I'm joined by returning guest Pete Sepp of the National Taxpayers Union. We share the same address, but do we share the same views? Find out as we discuss nonprofits and taxes in 2025. It's October 7th, 2024. Welcome to episode 257. Hey everybody, it's Monday, October 7th, and that means it's time for another episode of Radio Free 501c, brought to you by Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm Cecilia Sepp. I'm your host, and I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips. I'm also a CAE and an ACNP, and I want to thank you so much for joining us this week for this important episode. Quick reminder, if you haven't already followed us or subscribed on your favorite podcast service, please take a moment and do that so you don't miss any of our future episodes. So this week, we are talking about something that is eternal. There's an old saying, the only thing that you can count on is death and taxes, because those are the things that always happen. It's been with us, especially confiscatory tax systems have been with us throughout history. The ancient Egyptian empire had probably the worst and most malicious tax collection agency known to man and women. So we're here today and talking about taxes. Well, hopefully it won't be the death of us. But in 2025, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 is going to expire at the end of the year in December of 2025. There's already a lot of talk and anxiety in the nonprofit community about what that might mean for us. So this week, I have a very special guest, Pete Sepp, who's president of the National Taxpayers Union. And we also shared the same address. So he's coming to us today from somewhere in our house. So Pete, welcome back to the podcast. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about yourself?
Well, thanks much for having me back. And of course, remember it was Scarlett O'Hara who said death, taxes, and childbirth. There's never enough time for any of them. We'll never have enough time to discuss the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We'll try to have to keep it, we'll have to try and keep it to 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, I agree. It's a complicated issue. And I say complicated because it's more confusing than it probably needs to be, but that's the tax system that we have. So before we dive into our content for today, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our global audience wherever you may be. And thanks again for joining us. Now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 is from the previous presidential administration in the United States, which was led by former President Donald Trump. National Taxpayers Union was part of the coalition that worked with that administration to help develop that law. Now that it's expiring in 2025, there's a lot of talk in the nonprofit community that we are now going to start being taxed like businesses. Now, where a lot of this anxiety is coming from is from two white papers from two different think tanks. For some reason, people seem to think that if a think tank issues a white paper, that means it's going to become policy. That's not necessarily so. Some of the points in these two white papers, and Pete's going to tell us a little bit more about those, were pulled out in a recent webinar offered by ASAE as part of the argument about why this is going to happen. But again, please keep in mind, the white paper from the Tax Foundation and the white paper from the Cato Institute are not policy. They are their perceptions and their suggestions of what is going on in the nonprofit status community. So Pete, I'm going to hand it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Tax Cut and Job Act of 2017, which is known as TCJA, and how it impacted nonprofits when it was first passed and how it might impact us when it expires?
Sure. TCJA has its evolution from a number of attempts to reform the tax system since the last big effort in 1986. I mean, there were subsequent tax relief laws passed under George W. Bush, some under Bill Clinton prior to George W. But this was designed to be a major overhaul of the personal tax code and especially the business side tax code. And the effort really was primarily driven in Congress, unlike the 1986 effort, which had a bit more collaboration and synergy between the executive and legislative branches. This one really was legislatively driven. It failed two, I would say even three times, various permutations with all kinds of alphabet soup acronyms, DBCFT and other things were proposed to try and replace, especially the business side tax system, with something that was more transparent and efficient. They failed pretty dismally. And there was a lot of touch and go negotiation all the way up until December of 2017 to try and hammer out something that could pass through the so-called Budget Reconciliation Congress, get through the Senate, which through reconciliation didn't require as many votes, and get it to President Trump's desk for a signature. Well, the TCJA had a number of different provisions that reduced personal income tax rates, whereas you had a range, seven brackets between 10 and 39.6%. TCJA did 10 to 37%, especially lowering some of the rates in the middle so that the median income Americans' tax rate and their bracket went from the 25% bracket to the 22% bracket. It also doubled the child tax credit, increased the estate tax exemption, cut the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%, making it competitive with most other industrialized countries, even with state corporate tax rates. It created a whole new international tax regime for companies that either have headquarters or do business here, but also have significant activity overseas. We call that the guilty beat fitty regime. Us tax dorks love to invent acronyms, and that really redefined the way that income from subsidiaries abroad coming back into the United States or going out into from the US was treated. And there's a myth out there that this whole thing collapses in 2025. That's not true. The corporate tax and the international regime and a few other provisions, those would stay past 2025 if Congress does nothing next year. Other provisions would be modified. The child tax credit would not go to zero. It would simply go back to its pre-TCJA level. So it's complex. There are a lot of moving parts here, and Congress may decide, well, it's too much for us to revisit, so we're just going to agree on a short-term extension of whatever is expiring and go home. That's a temptation that Congress loves to pursue very often because on the budget side, with appropriations, rather than actually pass a budget and stick to it every year, they pass continuing resolutions. They've done that in 44 of the past 47 years because they can't get it together. My organization and a lot of others all across the political spectrum want Congress to avoid that temptation in 2025 and actually think about rational tax policies going forward. What did we learn from the 2017 law? We've had 7, 8 years of experience. What should we re-examine? What should we keep? What should we ditch entirely? Those are all important questions, and a lot is on the table. So I'm saying that because the nonprofit community is not the only community thinking about how this debate will affect them. TCJA has often been misdescribed really as saying, well, it cut charitable donations or it took away the ability to deduct charitable contributions. Not true. What it did was double, more than double, the standard deduction that many people had claimed on their tax return, and it simply made it more attractive to do that rather than itemized charitable contributions and take a deduction that way. Some people still do, a lot of people don't. The simplification that promoted saved hundreds of millions of hours that would normally be spent on tax form preparation. It's important to bear that in mind. Those are hours that people might be able to spend volunteering for their favorite charitable organization now.
Well, and I don't think it had an impact on people donating money. I think the United States is still the most generous country on the planet when it comes to sharing what we have with others. I think the standardized deduction being doubled probably made it easier for people to make those end of year donations because, as you said, all those hours were saved and you had
Well,
time to do that.
right. And there have been studies claiming that there was zero impact on charitable giving from the tax changes. Others say no, there was one, something like 15 to 20 billion dollars of giving that has been reduced because of the new tax laws. Well, you frame that with more than $500 billion of charitable giving every year, and you realize even in the worst case scenario, it's not a lot of change. And in fact, it's less in many cases than the changes in charitable giving that result from things like inflation, families simply not having the money to give. Those kinds of things, the economy overall, tend to drive changes at the margin in charitable giving more than tax policies.
Yeah. See, and I agree with that. I think the wallet impacts that more than anything else, because I think if a person is a generous individual and wants to share what they have with others, they're going to do that if they get a tax deduction or not. I know you and I like to do that. We like to make our end of year donations, but we're not necessarily itemizing either. I have heard of a certain public figure who used to count how many pairs of underwear she donated to charity and would write that off. But do we really want to spend our time doing that? But one of the things that I noticed, Pete, when you were outlining all the major components of TCJA, there was no major component that even addressed nonprofit status.
Yeah, very little. There are, of course, some policies at the edges, excise taxes on really large endowments at universities, for example, but very, very little that has occurred in tax law in recent years that touches dramatically the nonprofit sector. And that, of course, gives people a lot of pause to think about whether there does need to be a reevaluation of, okay, what types of income that nonprofits might have that ought to be taxable. Is the unrelated business income tax serving its purpose? And does that have to be explored? On the giving side, there are those who say, well, we might as well just get rid of all itemized deductions and move to what's called a pure consumption base in taxation. So that's simpler, and we can have much, much lower tax rates as a result. That doesn't mean that's where Congress is going to go. We have to remember that Republicans had a trifecta in 2017 when they began their power in Washington, and they couldn't repeal Obamacare and replace it, which was one of their big pledges. And all of this talk about junking the entire tax code for something like a 15% national sales tax or a 17 or 19% flat tax, that all fell by the wayside pretty quickly when they got into all of the technical details of what they had to do. That's what's going to happen here. And many of the plans we are seeing right now from think tanks, and I know the people behind these plans very well, they are smart people, they are thoughtful people, they are putting these out there as illustrative exercises to show policymakers here is the outer boundary of the possible. Now, work your way back and see the actual reality on the ground of what is possible.
in what could happen. I have to say, those two papers give me a lot of pause. I think that nonprofit organizations suggesting policies that would definitely lead to, I shouldn't say definitely, but could lead to the demise of the nonprofit status is basically suicidal. One of them, the Cato Institute, has a large endowment. So if the nonprofit status went away, they could transform probably easier than others into doing some other kind of work. I know other groups that are foundations that are driven by policy don't have as big a war chest, so to speak. They don't have as much revenue. They don't have as much money in the bank as the Cato Institute. So when we're looking at these things, these are people who are making suggestions. They're not any stronger than any other white paper that might be issued by an organization, in my opinion. It's just their take on the situation. There's, of course, the influence game in Washington, D.C. Some have more influence than others. As a person who watches these things, I do know the Tax Foundation does have a certain amount of influence because they work directly with the policymakers. Cato Institute's a little bit kind of an outlier because they're libertarian. And if they had a lot of influence, we would have a libertarian government right now and probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think also what's getting lost in this discussion, because there's fear being built up, there's anxiety being built up. What we're seeing here is what we're not seeing here is the difference between the nonprofit organizations that fall within the 501c section of the code and organizations that are tax exempt and are somewhere else in the code. And one of the examples you shared with me were credit unions and how they're considered tax exempt, but are they actually a nonprofit?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And let me just divert for one moment here. We're talking about two plans for tax reform, and this nonprofit piece is one mention in Cato's plan. It's a paper that Tax Foundation put out. Again, I know the authors really well, but this is in the context. Look at this chart here. This is published by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They are outlining no fewer than 8 comprehensive plans from various organizations with a whole raft of things that they would do, again, as an illustrative exercise, certainly reflecting their policy preferences, but knowing that it's not going to come out looking exactly like this on the other end if and when Congress finally produces a response. I mean, this is left, right, and center, from Progressive Policy Institute, from American Enterprise Institute, Tax Foundation, Cato. They're putting these things out now to get this conversation going. Nonprofits need to be a good, thoughtful part of that conversation. You don't necessarily have to start shrieking from the mountaintop, but you do have to sit at the table and say, here's what we think you need to bear in mind when you're trying to unravel the nonprofit picture. I mean, that was John Graham, wasn't it, that he said when you've seen one association, you've seen one association.
Yes, that is
That's
what John Graham, the late John Graham, used to say that. That's right.
that's often what it is here. And the credit union piece is a perfect illustration. They are in the 501c3 universe. That's what they're classified as. Now, they are reporting 800 some $billion worth of assets. All right. And this is one point that both the Tax Foundation and the Cato Institute papers make very strongly, that we have nonprofit entities under the 501c code that are competing directly with profit-making entities providing some of the same services. Credit unions were conceived as a way for people in communities with similar interests, say trades or geographic location, to band together and create savings institutions that would serve them at a highly localized level. That's not necessarily what all credit unions are about today. I mean, some of them have purchased stadium naming rights. Others have been gobbling up small community banks. They've been buying them up and expanding their footprint. Now, you talk with somebody at the Credit Union Association, they'll say, you're all wrong. We still serve the community. You talk to someone at the Independent Community Bankers Association, and they'll say, they're wrong because
Yes.
our people are being put at a disadvantage by being directly competed against from institutions that don't pay taxes. And the other thing is, here again, to prove John Graham's point, federally chartered credit unions are exempt from UBIT.
Mhm.
So, you
I'm
know,
sorry, I need to clarify that. They're exempt from UBIT because I don't know of anybody who's exempt from UBIT.
no, they are not subject because they are considered to be federal entities. They're federally chartered.
Oh, but they still get the C3 status, even though
Right.
they're federally chartered.
And
Well, that's
so,
very similar to a museum, though. The National Building Museum is chartered by Congress.
or the Smithsonian.
See, okay.
Now,
Well, I understand that comparison because a credit union is basically a smaller version of a bank. And so it's like how you and I love to complain about how bike riders can't decide if they want to actually act like a motor vehicle and use the road correctly or stay in the bike lane.
well, they used
Seems
to
to
be.
me that the credit union is trying to get, use the bike lane and the road at the same time, and whereas banks can only use the road. So
They
in
used
that example, oh,
they used to be that small.
mhm.
And there are also state chartered credit unions, but the federally chartered ones don't have to submit the same kind of 990 that a C3 does, a Form 990. So, these are the kind of curious carve outs that deserve a second look right now if we're going to delve into how to define our tax base. That doesn't mean that it'll all turn out against one side or for another side, but why not consider these questions?
Well, and I think that's an important question because what I think a strong theme in both of these papers, the Cato Institute paper and the Tax Foundation paper, are focusing on is that distinction of a credit union situation competing with a bank who has to follow a different set of rules. Now, if you are I'm going to just say it this way, if you are a true nonprofit under the 501c code, meaning you are there to serve a purpose that is different from making money, then I think that needs to be differentiated from these things. The fact that a credit union can be a C3 is outrageous because then they go out and they buy community banks, which are not C3s or any 501c. They're actually buying for profit banks and then merging them into their C3. And that is really what's detrimental to the rest of us who are actually doing nonprofit work. And nonprofit work being in a 501c organization where we do have a unique purpose to serve society by helping a profession be better, helping industry be better, or we're helping people in need, whatever it is we're doing. Or maybe we are driven by policy. We are really passionate about policy. So we work at a C4 because we're trying to get these policies known and supported and implemented. And that's a big difference. And this leads me to another thing. It's not directly related to taxes. Everybody's very upset about the taxes because they think they're going to start taxing membership dues and they're going to start taxing meeting registrations. And to me, this is a rumor that got started because nobody said that. It didn't happen before we had TCJA and we had a tax deficit before TCJA. People are saying, well, now there's going to be a tax deficit because the cuts are going away. Well, if the cuts are going away, that means taxes are going to increase again. So there's not necessarily a hole in the tax revenue pocket over here that we need to fill with this. But what I think this is an opportunity to do is to stand up and really protect the nonprofit status and really make sure that's being used appropriately and to clean it up. There's a lot of people who abuse the nonprofit status, and not just in like the credit unions competing with banks, but a lot of individuals start nonprofits and they don't come in with the sincerest of motivations, and they end up walking away with a lot of money in their own pocket rather than distributing it to the people they say they're going to help. There's a lot of abuse of the nonprofit status, and this is an opportunity not just to educate people about it, but to help also educate people about the abuses. And we need to stop the abuse of the nonprofit status because it makes all the rest of us look bad.
Well, true. And I think it's important to realize that these rumors are not entirely unfounded.
Mhm.
What you have are folks, including the author of the Tax Foundation paper, saying, look, the types of income that UBIT ought to be applied to, those need to be expanded. And we need to take a look at things like trade show revenues, for example, because even though TCJA's expiration will largely increase taxes, trying to extend TCJA is going to require revenue raising offsets or spending cuts to keep the deficit from ballooning even worse than it already is. The annual deficits are in the trillions, no end in sight with our entitlement programs going broke. And with the national debt already at 35 trillion, about 100% of our annual economic output, we are in serious, serious economic trouble, and it's only going to get worse. And so that in that context, people are saying, well, we have to take a look everywhere in the tax base and see if there are opportunities to preserve the most important pro-growth, pro-family, pro-individual parts of the tax code without blowing up the deficit. And to do that, we're going to have to look at some of these provisions. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of those conclusions. And the author of the Tax Foundation paper even says in one of the subheaders in the paper that it's challenging to identify truly charitable activities in the C3 community versus those that are business-like. And I would agree with that.
Hmm.
What if you said, I mean, that membership dues were suddenly subject to UBIT? Well, how do you separate that out from people who want to join at a high level of contribution versus the actual dues amounts? And would nonprofits simply adjust their dues structures so that they are not required to necessarily report a margin that's UBIT? I mean, you can do that. I've often said this. If you want to squeeze blood out of a turnip, the turnip has options too. He can begin self-identifying as a carrot, and
There you go.
suddenly the blood can be extracted.
That's right. Well, if they do that, they better watch out for the rabbits because somebody's
That's
always
right.
after you. But now you've made a comment just a moment ago about a UBIT margin. There's not necessarily a margin for UBIT. UBIT is related to your mission. So
Right.
if a great example, we've been talking a lot about C3, a lot of the rest of the concern really is from C6 communities. But a C3 is for the public good. So even if you have membership in a C3, which you shouldn't, because that's not the right code, that's not the right designation for you. But let's say you're a C3 membership group. If you offer a certification that falls under UBIT because it's unrelated business income tax, because you are for the public good, a certification program doesn't help the public, it only helps your members. So that's why you have to pay taxes on it. But if you slide over to the C6 category and you offer a certification, you don't have to pay UBIT on it because your C6 is for the betterment of your members and the service of your members. It's nonprofit in that helping a profession be better, helping an industry be better, makes the world a better place because they're doing a better job. They have higher standards, their knowledge base is expanded, and they have built networks of people to help move that mission forward. And so that's where UBIT, I think, gets a little fuzzy. And it seemed to me in both of those papers, one of their arguments was just to get rid of UBIT and just start taxing nonprofits like they are regular businesses. And that's not fair to a C3 that's feeding the hungry. Who are they
Right.
competing with? The other starving people?
Well, and
So I
again,
think
yeah, you're right. And again, one of the paper's authors says it's challenging to define an organization that's truly benevolent because after all, there are lots of for-profit organizations that do a lot of good. I mean,
Mhm.
there are plenty of businesses that give away part of their profit, either to charity or they sink it into their own internal benevolent activities. Um, but, you have to start thinking about how you would like to see your own sector or profession evolve. And then once you've got that vision, you think of, well, what types of government policies work for or against that vision? And I mean, as the author of the Tax Foundation points out, I'll just read this. The largest nonprofit in America is Kaiser Permanente. Its health plan, hospitals, and state health plans generated more than 110 billion in combined tax-exempt revenues. No other nonprofit came close to Kaiser's revenues. If Kaiser were for profit, it would be among the Fortune 40 in revenues. Is
I
that, I mean, is that something we all ought to be thinking about?
I agree. I think we do because again, I think that's an abuse of the 501c status at
Yeah,
this point. And frankly, I was surprised to learn Kaiser Permanente was a nonprofit of any kind. I thought they were a for-profit company because they're so big.
yeah,
But again, when you think about where they started back in 1946, they were federally chartered to offer health insurance to federal employees. And that
right.
was their in. I think, and people are going to, okay, go ahead, hit me with the angry postcards if you want to, folks. I think the IRS needs to be stricter about approving 501c status going forward. I think they need to look more closely at people who are trying to incorporate as a C3 membership organization. Just because everybody else is doing it doesn't make it right. I actually had somebody talk to me about that a few years ago and said, well, all the other membership groups in our healthcare area are C3s. And I said, but that doesn't make it the right thing to do or the best way for you. It's going to cause you a lot of other problems. But this is why, if we don't understand our own status, if we don't encourage other people to understand that status, this is why we end up being a target because we're everywhere. It's like Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we will surely hang separately. And another thing people overlook, oh, sure, the TCJA expiration, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. Congress might let it expire, and then taxes are going to go up, and there won't be a need to fill a revenue hole necessarily. But if we don't hang together and make sure everybody understands why we're here, this is going to be an ongoing problem. This is just this week's issue. The ongoing problem is a lack of understanding of why we exist, what we contribute to society, and why we do get that special treatment of not having to pay federal income tax. What we also overlook is we have to pay state taxes, we have to pay local taxes, we still pay those employment taxes. So the only thing we don't pay is tax on income because we exist to help others, whether again it's a profession and industry or we are doing a service in the community. And that's where again the language can get a little confusing because we're talking about charitable donations or charitable activity. Well, a C6 doesn't exist to do charitable activities. They exist to help a profession or an industry be better and do better. And by doing that, that makes the world a better place. And that's why they're allowed to use that. It's the business league category. Business leagues move things forward. But when we're looking at that overall, should we be taxing things more in the nonprofit community? And maybe that would straighten some people up and get them to fly right. You used the example of the trade show because that brings in so much money. And is that really directly related to mission? I could see the argument in both directions, but I could see people saying a trade show is UBIT.
Yeah. And these are not easy questions, of course. And Phil, kind of flowing into all of this is politics, naturally. I mean, talk about angry postcards. You may get requests for equal time after this from Kaiser and the credit unions. You never know. But if there were some kind of congressional attack on the nonprofit sector, again, I think on the Republican conservative side, it's mainly going to be aimed at nonprofits that look and act like businesses, even though they're not treated that way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and what would be the immediate response there? I can tell you this, whether it's an insurer or gigantic hospital systems that are nonprofits, first thing they would do, yeah, here. You would see an ad in the Union Station Metro and the Capitol South Metro, the two metro stations where Capitol Hill staff exit and enter every day. Something like America's nonprofit hospitals serving communities and patients and the economy one at a time. And you'd have a poor foundling waif being examined by an earnest young doctor. And that's all permissible under C3s. C3s, of course, can lobby a bit, but they have
Yes,
to be very careful about that. Those would be public education ads. They could
that's right.
spend tens of millions of dollars on that stuff, geofenced around Capitol Hill, back in the districts. Credit unions, you bet they'll do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They all have genuine smaller entities and members that they could put forth and say, I'm the one that's going to be affected, even though the big boys would hide behind that. I mean, that's the politics of the situation that we have to appreciate here. When you propose a policy, that's different from proposing a political solution that moves forward and can actually be signed into law.
That's
And
right.
so that makes the task actually less challenging for the nonprofit community, knowing that there will be certain nonprofits with a whole lot of money who can do advertising to blunt the most radical of proposals. Then you get down to the job that you described, sort
Mm-hmm.
of engaging government officials, both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, to say, here's why we're different. Here's why we have this status. Here's why you have to craft smart policy going forward. You do that rationally and calmly. Don't talk to them like they're dumb, because the handful of staff that will ultimately determine the package in 2025 are really smart. They can talk circles around anyone because they have all of this knowledge of histories of various tax policies affecting various sectors. I know because I talk to them every other day, and I better be sharp going in there. So do all of my colleagues. They are knowledgeable people. They're not all ignorant.
Well, and I think, the point you made about advocating, because a C3 can advocate and they can lobby within very strict guidelines. But I think you're right. I agree with you, although I don't know how many foundling waifs we actually have left in this country. There are not too many of them. So they'll get work if they're in those ads. But I think if we band together to advocate together, because advocating is educating, sharing messaging, sharing information. It's not asking people to make a choice one way or the other. And that's really the big difference. So a C6 can go in and say, please vote for this bill because it will preserve the nonprofit status and let us continue the work that we do. But a C3 cannot. They can say, let us tell you about what we do and why it's important. And that's really that balancing act. But really, when you do go into lobby, let's say you're at a C6 or a C4, even when you're lobbying, you're really educating. You're saying, here's what's going on from our perspective, here's what we're doing and why. And so if we as a nonprofit community can pull together and share a common message, we need to get rid of the division within the nonprofit community if we are to be successful in protecting the nonprofit community. But again, I see this as a real opportunity to clean house, so to speak, and really straighten it up. I think it's our opportunity to not just survive the expiration of TCJA, but to go on into the future and have that conversation about how can we make the rules stricter for nonprofit? How can we make it harder to become a nonprofit? I use the term sometimes dining room table nonprofits, because people start them because, let's say, their cat died from some cat disease, and they say, well, I'm going to start a foundation to help people with this cat disease. They don't know what they're getting into. They don't understand the law. They don't understand the rules. They don't understand what it takes. So you have all these like 501c organizations out there muddying the waters, not knowing what they're doing, taking attention away from other things that could be moved forward. And yes, is that harsh? Yes, it is. It is a harsh statement, but I remember years ago, I was having a conversation at a reception with someone, and he was saying there were too many nonprofits. And I disagreed with him. I got angry. I said, oh, how can you say that about our profession? Well, now here we are 15, 20 years later, and I know he was right. There's too many that aren't functioning. It's like podcasts. There's millions of podcasts out there. Most of them have done like 5 episodes and stopped, but they're still out there. So there's podcasts that produce and there's podcasts that don't. There's nonprofits who are actually nonprofits doing things, acting on behalf of others in whatever capacity that is. And there's nonprofits who are just sitting there doing nothing, getting in the way, making people wonder about us. The other thing out there, though, that's a consistent thread, in my opinion, is activist state attorney generals. There are a lot of people in the United States who don't like the nonprofit status and don't think it should exist. And there's state attorney generals out there going after nonprofits because they're trying to shut them down. And if one nonprofit gets shut down that way, we're next. So there's other things we need to consider besides TCJA expiring next year.
That's right. And it's very easy to say, well, I don't like that nonprofit's political bent, so good that the government's going after them. There's no way, once you turn the attack dog loose, it will bite anyone. I've seen this with Federal Trade Commission, IRS, state attorneys general. It doesn't matter. And that's a very important point. I would also say we have to look at the opportunities here beyond what the rates are going to be. How are we going to define the base? Who gets this or that deduction, credit, or exemption? There's an opportunity to improve the administration of the tax code. You know this, Cecilia. This has been a passion of mine since I worked on the first Taxpayer Bill of Rights in 1988. IRS reforms, there's another big package brewing in the Senate Finance Committee that we're going to be a part of. But consider how much wasted time and effort is made just complying with this system from a nonprofit's perspective. Yes, you have the postcard-sized 990 returns, and the IRS brags that this is where the vast majority of nonprofits file. That may not be the typical nonprofit experience for people who are watching this program. That's the thing. If you have any number of employees, say more than 2, and you have any sizable amount of revenue, my organization is in the 5 to 7 million range with 24 employees. I don't care saying that. You can see it all on the IRS's own website. All our stuff is there. I feel like, and I'm reviewing our own 990s now because we always file for an extension. I feel like I've been to my gastroenterologist and gotten scoped one into the other. It is a tremendously draining experience, not only for me, but for 2 of my staff, an accounting firm and a separate tax preparation firm. The amount of time and money we pour into this for upwards of 100 pages of filings is incredible. Why don't we have a conversation with Congress and the IRS about that? How do we streamline this process for those nonprofits kind of in the middle of the pack who don't have a full-time accounting team yet aren't so small that they can just fill out a postcard and toss it in the mail? That's a tremendous barrier to growth.
I agree. And when you think about the number of hours your staff uses to do this, and you also mentioned you're working with outside contractors to get this done, this is a phenomenal waste of time for a document that is basically an information form
Yeah. Well,
because
you
there's
know
no
where I'm
money.
going to be this weekend.
Yes, I do. I will find something else to do while you're doing that. Uh, but one of the things I want to say about postcards is I think they need to get rid of that postcard form. I think if all 501(c)s were held to the same 990 filing status, that would help tremendously in the quality of 501(c) service. Because if you just had to fill out a little postcard and throw it in the mail, how seriously are you taking the management of your 501(c) organization? I think it opens up the door to too many of these dining room table nonprofit organizations. And as far as like your comment about wanting equal time for Kaiser Permanente or the Credit Union Association, I say bring it. You want to be on the show? We'll make it happen. I doubt they are listening to this because they're probably too busy counting all their money and putting their name on stadiums and finding foundling waifs and giving them employment. So, well, this has been a great conversation as always. I know you and I will continue it as we always do. But as you know, Pete, I like to ask my guests, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And how can they get in touch with you if they would like to connect or learn more?
Sure. Remember, this is all incredibly complicated. And to my earlier point, this is not just about tax policy, it's about tax administration, not just the way we think about the rates and the exemptions and the credits and the deductions, but how we have to comply with it day in and day out. I'd love to see more nonprofits speaking out about the how, not just the what in terms of tax policy. Now, if folks would like to get in touch with me, if they'd like to learn more about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I have an ideal primer on the topic. It's a take on what they used to say on Seinfeld. It's called What's the Deal with Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiration in 2025. It's got a fantastic chart of what happens to the law when it expires, what it was doing prior to 2017. If you want to go get up to speed about what's in, what's out, that's the place to start. You can find out more about us at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. I would love to make an advance request to appear on your podcast, say in the early spring or late winter of next year, when we're going to know more about the political situation and we'll know just how wrong I've been about everything I've said on this.
Well, I will give that serious consideration. I think a lot of it depends on what kind of Christmas presents I get.
Oh, okay. I'll have to get
No, that,
shopping.
that's great. Well, Pete, that resource you just shared, is that accessible on the NTU website? And
Indeed, it
and
is.
is it easy to find?
Type in what's the deal in the search bar. It'll come right up.
Right. Okay, that's great. And that sounds like a great resource for all nonprofits who are concerned about this issue and concerned about our status in the future, not just in 2024 and 2025, but what's going to happen in 2026. Let's stay on top of this because, as Pete said, Seinfeld, what's the deal? We don't want to be the person on the other end of that line. Shouldn't you be out on a ledge somewhere because the tax situation has driven us crazy? Well, I want to thank Pete for joining me this week. And yes, he will be back, but hopefully he's motivated to consider the holiday season a little more seriously this year.
I'm
Pending that.
motivated, all right.
So, well, we have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. If you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, we're on all the major podcast services, so I'm sure you can find us on your favorite one. So please take a moment to do that. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box and think differently, check out our website, roguetulips.com. I'm always up for a conversation, so let's talk and see if we could work together. If you are interested in education for nonprofit management, especially if you are taking the CAE exam or looking for CAE renewal credits like the ethics credit, check out our education page on the website. We are known for our quality education, especially when it comes to our flagship course, the ethics course. So check all of that out too. And don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Rogue Speak. So that's it for this week. On behalf of Pete and myself, we'll see you next time.